In the Mississippi Delta, where the air was so thick with humidity, blood was more than just a liquid. It was a form of money, a sign of family ties, and a reason for slavery. Medical journals from the 1850s are full of strange names for the diseases that enslaved people had, like cachexia africana, a wasting disease, and trichomania, the supposed madness that made a man run away from captivity. But in the sealed records of Adams County, Mississippi, for the year 1851, there is a coroner's report for a white planter named Silas Croft that doesn't fit into any category. The cause of death is listed as catastrophic exsanguination, but the body had no wounds that could have killed it, no signs of an animal attack, and no signs of a fight. The doctor, a scientist from Natchez, simply wrote in his private ledger, "It is as if the man's very veins were emptied. I have never seen a body so pale, so utterly drained." The 47 slaves who saw the event from the edge of the cotton field would only whisper for a century what the doctor was too afraid to write. The name of the man who stood over Silas Croft's body as the last of his lifeblood darkened the rich black soil. They called him Caleb, and because his skin was very white, his hair was very light, and his eyes were a strange rose-pink color, they also called him the Ghost. The soft, steady sound of flint scraping against stone, and the thick, wet sound of river mud being moved. According to the official story, a runaway slave killed his master and then disappeared. But the truth, which has been hidden for generations by fear and coded spirituals, is much scarier. It's not just a story about murder, it is a story about medicine, insanity, and a ritual of revenge so exact that people thought it was magic. Cypress Bend Plantation was not a nice place to be. It was a scar on the ground, 900 acres of cotton fields that were taken from the swamp that bordered the Homachito River. The air was heavy, even at dawn, with the smell of decay, damp earth, and magnolia that didn't cover up the smell of human misery. The plantation house itself was a stark white monument to its owner's ambition, a Greek revival-style building with columns that seemed to mock the landscape. Silas Croft, its master, was a man in his late 40s who was obsessed with blood to the point of suffocation. He talked about it all the time, the blood of his horses, the blood of his hounds, and most importantly, the blood of his own family, which he traced back to English nobility with a passion that was almost religious. He didn't see his slaves as people. He saw them as extensions of his property, vessels of lesser blood, and tools for growing the white gold that made him a king in this hot, cruel kingdom. But Croft had a secret behind his starched linen shirts and his facade of complete control. His own blood was betraying him. His expensive doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. He was getting weaker and weaker, which made him more likely to get bruises, feel dizzy, and have a persistent rattling cough that sometimes left a rust-colored stain on his handkerchief. He was most ashamed of this secret illness. He thought it was an impurity, a taint on the perfect bloodline he held so dear. Caleb was different from the other 112 souls that Silas Croft owned. 3 years earlier, he had been bought from a bankrupt estate in Louisiana. He had no name but the one in the ledger, and his looks scared the other slaves. He was an albino, which means he was a black man with no pigment in his skin. In the Mississippi sun, his skin looked like stark porcelain white that burned red. His hair was fine and light, and his eyes, which had no color, looked like they were glowing with a soft pink light, especially at dusk. He was tall and thin, and he moved in a way that made me very uneasy. He would show up at the edge of a field or the door of the cookhouse without making a sound, with his eyes fixed and distant. Not only because of how he looked, but also because of this ghostly quality, the other slaves called him the Ghost. He didn't talk much, and when he did, his voice was low and flat. He was alone, in a liminal space. He wasn't white, But he didn't have the same skin as the others. The overseer's superstitious cruelty made him a target, but the people he worked with stayed away from him. No one at Cypress Bend knew, and the Louisiana slave trader hadn't told them, that Caleb was more than just a field hand. His mother, a healer from the Congo, had taught him how to do things the old way. She had passed down a deep understanding of the body, the earth, and the power that flowed in the blood that came before European medicine. Caleb knew how to fix broken bones, stitch up wounds, and read the body's secrets, like its weaknesses, poisons, and breaking points. By the summer of 1851, Silas Croft's private war with his own body was getting worse. Dr. Alistair Finch, a doctor in Natchez, had bled him, purged him, and given him laudanum and mercury, but nothing worked. The weakness got worse. His skin looked waxy and thin, and the bruises that popped up on his arms and legs from the smallest bump were a constant, visible reminder of how bad he was doing. His obsession with bloodlines grew out of control. He would spend hours in his study looking over his family tree, as if the ink on the page could somehow give him more energy when he was losing it. He got more violent, and his temper flared up at the smallest sign of disobedience. He wanted everything to be pure, but he himself felt deeply, terrifyingly impure. Clara, the head house slave and the woman who changed his dirty bedsheets, was the first to connect the master's need with the whispers from the quarters. She had heard the field workers talk about Caleb. They said he had used a poultice of river mud and spiderweb to cure a child of a fever. They said he had saved a man from bleeding to death after a fight by using only a chant and a certain kind of crushed leaf. They were afraid of what they knew, but they respected it. Clara, a woman who lived by watching and figuring out the complicated power dynamics in the house, put this information away. She saw her master get worse, and she saw the white-skinned ghost in the fields who didn't say anything. She knew with a cold clarity that these two forces were going to crash into each other. A man named Marcus was the cause. He was a strong field hand and one of the few people who had ever done something nice for Caleb, like leaving a piece of dried fruit by the door of his empty cabin. Marcus had passed out from heat stroke in early August. Finley, the overseer, had told him to get a bucket of dirty water and go back to the row. Marcus, who was out of his mind, had fallen against Finley, and his blood and sweat had stained the overseer's shirt. Finley beat him up for this attack. The punishment was planned out, and it was a cold, brutal lesson with a black snake whip. The sun was beating down on Caleb and the other slaves who were lined up. He stood perfectly still, his pale eyes unblinking, not looking at Marcus but at Silas Croft, who was on the porch of the big house drinking whiskey. Croft's face didn't show any emotion, but his hand, the one holding the glass, was shaking. Caleb saw this shake. He could tell that the master's grip was weak, that his skin was thin, and that the veins at his temple were a little blue. He saw Croft turn away, a look of disgust on his face. It wasn't because of the violence. It was because of the sight of Marcus's blood, which seemed to bother his sensitive feelings. At that point, Caleb's careful watching turned into a plan. He wasn't just a healer. His mother had also taught him how to be a channel. As August turned into a hot September, Croft's facade of control began to break down. He fell down the main staircase because he was dizzy. The result was a deep cut on his leg that wouldn't heal. It got worse, oozing a thin, yellowish fluid, and the leg grew to twice its normal size. Dr. Finch talked about cutting off a limb. The word scared Croft more than death. Being hurt or not whole was an attack on his idea of purity. He locked himself in his study, and the smell of laudanum and his own illness came through the door. Clara was the one who finally did something. She was Marcus's sister and Croft's house slave at the same time. She had seen Caleb look at the master. She had seen the cold, smart light in his pink eyes. One night, she snuck out of the house and went to Caleb's small, lonely hut on the edge of the swamp. He was outside sharpening a piece of river cane with a piece of flint. Clara whispered, "The master is dying," her voice tight. "His blood is poison. The doctor wants to take his leg." Caleb didn't look up from what he was doing. The only sound was the flint scraping, scraping, scraping. Caleb said in a low voice, "He is not my master. He is a sickness. If he dies," Clara said, "his brother will get everything. He is a worse man. He will sell us all south. He will sell my children." Caleb stopped. He looked at the sharpened piece of cane, which had an edge that was almost see-through. "What do you want from me, Clara?" "The whispers," she said. "They say you have the old knowledge. Can you heal him? Can you cleanse him?" Caleb finally looked up, and the moonlight made his pale eyes shine. There was no warmth in them, just a deep, chilling stillness. He said, "I can. But the cure is of the earth. It must be done in the earth, and the price is blood." Clara became the go-between. She went back to the house, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She found Silas Croft in his study, with a fever that made him crazy, his leg propped up on a pillow, and the smell of infection in the air. She waited until the laudanum had made him feel a little better before making her offer. "Master Croft," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "Dr. Finch's medicine isn't working." Croft's eyes, which were clouded with pain, quickly turned to hers. "Are you making fun of me, girl?" "No, sir," she said, lowering her head. "There is another way, a folk cure. The slaves talk about it." Croft, the man who was obsessed with pure bloodlines, laughed dryly, which turned into a cough. "You want me to get better by seeing a witch doctor? By their dirt and superstitions?" "They say it is a cure of the blood," Clara said, putting the word in his head that he couldn't resist. "They say the ghost knows how to draw the sickness out and clean the blood." The word purify hung in the air. Croft looked at her with his mind racing. He was torn between the horror of having to have his arm cut off and the shame of his body not working right. He was a man who was going to drown, and she had just pointed to a branch, no matter how bad it looked. "This ghost," he said in a low voice. "Caleb, sir. He says the sickness is in the blood itself. He says he can let it out. Let it out." The thought was both scary and tempting. It was like the white doctor's bloodletting, but it sounded different, more basic and more complete. "What does this ghost want?" Croft asked, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "He asks for nothing, sir," Clara lied. "He just wants it done his way, at a place he chooses where the ground is strong." Croft lay back and breathed slowly. He was stuck. His own pure blood was killing him, and the only person who could save him was a man he thought was less than human, a man whose very appearance was a mockery of racial purity. "Tell him," Silas Croft whispered, his voice breaking. "Tell him I will do it, but if he fails, if he tricks me, I will burn him alive." Caleb took the news with the same unsettling calm that he did everything else. He just nodded and kept his pale eyes on the cypress trees that were getting darker and were the edge of the swamp. He had known this day would come ever since he saw Croft shake on the porch. He knew that the man's pride was a shell, and that inside it was only fear, the fear of the body betraying him. He started getting ready, and anyone who looked could see it. He didn't want to keep this a secret. He walked to the bank of the Homochito, and his bare feet sank into the thick gray mud. He picked up big handfuls of it, which was full of dead plants and animals, and put it in a wooden bucket. He found a stand of blackjack oak and peeled off the bark, which he knew was full of tannins that could cause infection. He gathered moss, spider webs, and the wide, waxy leaves of a plant that the other slaves called Devil's Trumpet. But the most important thing he did was go to a patch of wild cane and pick 5 thick stalks. The heat was unbearable all afternoon, and the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of his flint shard echoed through the quarters. He was sharpening the cane, splitting the ends and making them stronger by putting them in the embers of a small, smokeless fire. He was making tools. They were not the sharp steel lancets that Dr. Finch used. They were used by a hunter or maybe a priest. He was getting ready for a ritual, and the theater of it was just as important as how it worked. He needed the other slaves to look. He had to tell the story. The people in the quarters went from avoiding each other to being scared. Caleb's planned and open preparations were a show, and the slaves were forced to watch. They saw the mud in the river, the strange herbs, and the sharpened cane stalks. This wasn't the quiet, familiar healing they had talked about. This seemed like something else. Obaya, Guju, and the dark work were all here. Caleb walked by old Auntie Tish, who remembered whispers of the old country. She spat on the ground. "That ain't no healing," she said to the younger women. "That's a calling. He calls and summons, and you aren't talking to a good spirit. The blood—" The fear was also useful. They were scared of what the master would do when this cure didn't work. They knew how angry Croft got when his hope turned to ash. He would set fire to them all. But they were even more afraid of Caleb. He was no longer just the ghost, the poor albino that people felt sorry for or stayed away from. He was now a dangerous, active force. He was openly dealing in powers that they didn't understand. He was bringing darkness to the plantation, and they were afraid it wouldn't go away. They were afraid it would stay in the soil and water long after he and the master were gone. Their avoidance turned into a quarantine. When he walked by, they brought their kids inside. They wouldn't look him in the eye with his pink eyes. They left him completely alone, a man surrounded by people, but stuck on an island with a terrifying purpose. Clara moved around the big house in a cold, quiet way. She was the one who planned this impossible meeting, which took place between the master's study and the slave's hut. She felt no guilt. Guilt was a luxury she could not afford. She was loyal to her own kids and to the fragile hope that this act, no matter what happened, might shake up the terrible, predictable order of Cypress Bend. She saw Silas Croft get ready. He was a man who was letting go of his own world. He had Clara burn his dirty sheets, which was a ritualistic way for him to get rid of his own sickness. He wrote a long, rambling letter to his brother in Virginia and sealed it with wax. His hands shook so much that the red wax spilled all over the desk. He was getting ready to die or to be reborn in a way that felt like death. Clara did not just watch. She acted. She knew that Finley, the overseer, always started his rounds in the northern fields. She knew he would not reach the red field until mid-morning. She ensured the laudanum bottle was left on Croft's bedside table, not to ease his pain, but to ensure his mind was clouded, his will weakened, his fear and desperation overriding his reason. She was not a passive observer. She was a co-conspirator, a pragmatist clearing the path for a collision she could not fully predict, but which she knew was necessary. She was as much a part of the ritual as Caleb. Her weapon not a sharpened cane, but a precise understanding of her master's schedule, his weaknesses, and his mind. What was this cure Caleb intended to perform? It was not the simple magic the slaves feared, nor the primitive butchery Croft secretly suspected. It was a precise and syncretic medical procedure, born of his mother's Congo teachings and refined by his own cold, analytical observations. His mother had taught him that the body was a vessel of spiritual and physical fluids, and that blood was the most potent. She taught that sickness was an imbalance, a corruption that had to be drawn out and returned to the earth so the body could reset itself. He had seen Dr. Finch's methods: crude, dirty bloodletting from a vein that made the patient weaker. Caleb did it a different way. It was about drawing, not just letting go. He knew that the river mud, which was full of minerals and bacteria, would be a poultice that would make heat and bring the poison to the surface. The oak bark and other herbs would stop bleeding and clean the area. And the cane that was sharpened, they weren't for stabbing, they were for cupping. He would use them to make dozens of small, shallow cuts that were just deep enough to break the skin. Then he would use heated clay cups or hollowed gourds to make a vacuum that pulled the bad blood out of the tissue, especially from the swollen, infected leg. But he knew with a doctor's certainty what Silas Croft did not. The man's blood was not only dirty, it was also failing. It wouldn't clot the right way. He knew that a procedure that would be a harsh but survivable cleansing for a healthy man would kill Silas Croft. He wasn't planning to get better. He was planning a medically precise execution that looked like a healing ritual. Caleb picked the spot. It was a part of the cotton fields to the south that had not been used in a long time, close to the edge of the swamp. The slaves called it the red field because the soil was full of iron oxide, which made it look like rust. They stayed away from it. The cotton didn't grow well there, and the air felt thick. Caleb told Clara to tell him to come an hour before dawn, alone, and in only his sleeping shirt. He said that the sickness had to be able to leave his body and enter the earth. These instructions were both a ritual and a plan. Alone meant that no one was there to see him or stop him. Before dawn, the other slaves would be coming to work, which would give him a different group of witnesses as the ritual came to an end. Wearing a sleeping shirt meant being weak. A thunderstorm hit Cypress Bend that night. It was a violent tropical downpour that hit the fields and shook the windows of the big house. It was as if the sky was trying to clean the plantation or get the ground ready for a sacrifice. The rain stopped just before 3 a.m., leaving the world soaked, dripping, and eerily quiet, except for the sound of tree frogs and the sucking and pulling of the wet, black earth. The storm cleaned the air, making it cool for the first time in months. It was the perfect, clean setting for what was about to happen. The world was gray and black an hour before the sun came up. A thick, wet fog came off the Homachito River and covered the fields, making everything quiet. It stuck to the cypress trees, which made them look like crying giants. Silas Croft came out of the back door of his house like a man going to his own death. He was barefoot and only wearing a thin white linen sleeping shirt. He had taken laudanum, which made him move slowly and like he was in a dream. But his mind was sharp with fear and a desperate, burning hope. His sick leg was a huge weight, and he leaned heavily on a cane. He was in pain with every step as his bare feet sank into the cold, wet mud. He walked through the quiet slave quarters, a white figure in the fog that looked like a ghost. He was scared of the magic he was giving into, scared of the albino slave, but more scared of the gangrenous rot in his own leg than the surgeons saw. He followed the faint, swampy smell of the red field, his breath catching in his chest, and a prayer to a god he didn't really believe in turned to ash on his tongue. The silence was complete except for the thud, drag of his own painful progress. He was leaving behind his home, his power, and his world to enter Caleb's world, which was full of dirt, blood, and basic knowledge. Caleb was there. He wasn't in the middle of the field. He was at the edge, where the rows of cotton met the dark, tangled trees of the swamp. He picked a spot where the red, iron-rich soil was bare, and he used the rain from the night before to his advantage. He stood in the middle of a circle he had cleared, and his white skin glowed in the dark before dawn. He didn't have a shirt on, and his pale torso was covered in gray river mud. Around him, his tools were arranged in a ritualistic way. 5 sharpened cane stalks were driven into the ground with their points up. The thick, dark mud was in a clay bowl. Herbs and moss were stacked neatly in piles. He kept some dried wood safe and made a small fire that didn't smoke. The fire warmed up several small, smooth stones. Caleb didn't say anything when Croft staggered into the clearing, his eyes wide with fever and fear. He just pointed to the middle of the circle with his hand. Croft hesitated, looking back and forth between the tools and the man with the pale eyes who didn't seem to care. This was the last step. Silas Croft dropped his cane and fell to the wet red ground with a gasp of a sob that was half surrender and half despair. He lay on his back, looking up at the gray sky that didn't care about him. His sleeping shirt was wet with sweat and mud. Caleb walked toward him, and his bare feet didn't make any noise on the ground. The ceremony had started. Caleb worked at a terrifyingly fast, methodical pace. He didn't chant. He didn't say anything. The only thing he could say was what he did. He first put the thick, cold mud from the river around Croft's swollen, discolored leg, covering it from the ankle to the thigh. The mud was a poultice that was supposed to draw out the heat and poison, but it also hid what he was doing underneath. Then he took the hot stones out of the fire and put them on Croft's chest and stomach. The sudden heat made the master gasp. Caleb knew that this would make blood flow better, something his mother had taught him. Then he picked up the first sharpened cane. He didn't hit. He moved to the infected leg and started to make the cuts with the precision of a surgeon. They weren't very deep, but there were a lot of them, dozens of small, shallow cuts, arranged in a pattern up and down the swollen limb through the gray mud. Croft yelled, but it was a weak, thin sound. He was too sick and scared to fight back. The smell of blood, which was coppery and metallic, mixed with the smells of mud and wet ground. The blood, which was thin and dark, started to come out of the small cuts and turned the gray mud a sickening deep red. Caleb watched it flow without showing any emotion. He could tell the man was dying because of the color of the blood and how slowly it oozed. He was just helping. The plantation bell rang at 5:30 a.m., its dull iron clang cutting through the fog. It was time for the field workers to start their day. A group of 47 men and women, led by Finley the overseer, headed south to the fields. The fog was starting to clear up, burned away by the sun that couldn't be seen, and the world was showing through in soft watercolors. They stopped when they got close to the red field. Finley raised his hand, and his horse jumped up and down. Everyone could see it, about 50 yards away, in a bare spot of red earth. Caleb was standing over his master, Silas Croft, who was lying on the ground. He was naked from the waist up. The ghost was covered in blood and mud, which made his white skin look even worse. The slaves couldn't see the small cuts, the details, or the tools from where they were. They saw something much more basic. They saw their master lying still and pale, and the albino slave working on him with bloody hands. Caleb looked like he was pushing the master, taking the life out of him. It looked like the ground was drinking. Finley, who was shocked and pale, reached for the rifle on his saddle. He whispered, "What in God's name?" The slaves stayed still. They stood there, frozen in a silent, collective tableau of fear and disbelief. This was a world that had been turned upside down. They couldn't understand this act. Caleb thought the timing was perfect because the audience had come for the last act. He didn't pay attention to the slaves or Finley. He was only interested in Silas Croft. The master was getting weaker. His breathing was shallow and rattling, and his eyes rolled back, showing the whites. The cupping had worked. A healthy man could have lived through the cuts, but for Croft, they were a death sentence. His blood wasn't just oozing, it was flowing because of the heat, the suction, and the herbs. It couldn't clot. The mud poultice had turned into a thick, black-red sludge. Caleb took the clay bowl and used it to scoop up the bloody mud from the leg. Then he smeared it on Croft's chest in a pattern that his mother had taught him, a veve, which is a symbol of change and a prayer to the spirits of the crossroads. It looked like he was anointing the master with his own blood to the slaves who were far away. In his last moments of consciousness, Croft must have felt like he was getting a last unholy blessing. "The poison. Is it out?" Croft said in a hoarse voice that sounded like it was about to break. Caleb leaned in close with his pale face just a few inches from the master's. Caleb whispered, "It is purified," so only Croft could hear him. "The earth is taking it. Your blood is clean." Croft let out a small, strange sigh of relief. He thought he was better, and he died with his eyes fixed on the rising sun. Finley finally found his voice and yelled, "Step away from him, you devil!" His hands were shaking, but he had his rifle aimed. He was just as scared as the slaves. Caleb was a tall man, standing over 6 feet tall, which made him look scary. There was blood from Silas Croft all over him. It was on his face, chest, and hands. He had turned into what they were afraid of, a ghost that fed on blood. He slowly turned, not to Finley, but to the 47 slaves who were watching from the end of the row. He raised his bloody hands, palms out, in a gesture that was not giving up but showing. He kept looking at them, his pink eyes moving from one face to the next. He was making the picture stick in their minds. His stance said that this is what happens. This is the answer. This is the power you have forgotten. A woman in the front row fainted. Several others began to weep, not for the master, but from sheer, mind-breaking terror. Finley fired his rifle. The shot was wild, the bullet kicking up mud 10 feet to Caleb's left. The sound shattered the morning, and in that moment of chaos, as Finley fumbled to reload, as the slaves broke and ran, Caleb turned. He did not run. He simply walked with that same unnerving, silent pace and disappeared into the cypress swamp that bordered the field. He vanished into the fog, as if he were made of it. The red field was a scene of pandemonium. The slaves who had run did not stop until they reached the quarters, barring their doors, their wails and prayers rising in a cacophony of terror. Finley, left alone, circled the body on his horse, not daring to dismount. He stared at the corpse of Silas Croft. The man was a horror. His skin was a pale, waxy white, almost translucent. His sleeping shirt was saturated with a diluted, bloody mud. The bare earth around him was a dark, saturated stain, the iron in the soil already reacting with the sheer volume of blood, turning it a deep, blackish red. It looked impossibly as if the ground itself had fed. Finley was a brutal man, but he was not a stupid one. He knew what he was seeing, but he also knew that no one would believe it. It was a scene from a nightmare, a pagan sacrifice. He saw the discarded tools, the sharpened cane, the clay bowl, the strange, bloody herbs. He knew instinctively that this was not a simple murder. This was a ritual, and the sight of it chilled him to his core. He finally dismounted, his legs shaking, and touched 2 fingers to Croft's neck. The skin was cold despite the rising humidity. There was no pulse. There was, it seemed, no blood left. Finley stumbled back to his horse, mounted, and galloped to the great house, his face the color of ash. He hammered on the door, shouting for Clara, for anyone. When Clara opened it, her face a perfect, neutral mask, he could only point back toward the field. Finley stammered, "He's dead. The master. He's the ghost. He drained him. God help us. He drained him." Clara's mask didn't slip, but a small dark spark lit up her eyes. "The master was sick, Mr. Finley," she said, her voice low. "The ghost offered a cure. Perhaps the cure was too strong." Her words were a deflection, but also an insinuation. She was already shaping the narrative. This was not murder. It was a failed healing. This was not a supernatural event. It was a medical tragedy. Finley grabbed onto her words as if they were a lifeline, a healing that didn't work. Yes, that was easy to do. He could tell the sheriff about that. A voodoo cure that didn't work. He said the words again, testing them. It was still scary, but it was a scary person, not a demon. He shot his gun 3 times in the air, which was the alarm signal for the plantation. Caleb heard the sound in the cypress swamp a mile away, and it echoed through the wet fields. He stopped to wash the last of the blood and dirt off his hands in the dark, slow water of the Homochito River. After that, he went south. The big house, which had been a scary and sick place, suddenly became a different kind of mess. Croft didn't have a wife or kids. The brother in Virginia, whom Clara was afraid of, was his only heir. When they heard the alarm, the slaves in the house came out with looks of fear and a new, uncertain curiosity on their faces. When Finley told them the master was dead, a strange electric current ran through them. It wasn't happiness. It was the shock of a sudden, huge change in their lives. The center of their cruel world had just stopped. Clara was in charge. She was no longer just the head house slave. She was in charge. She sent a boy to Natchez to get the sheriff and Dr. Finch. She told the other slaves to lock the doors and stay inside. "There's a ghost in the swamp," she said, and her voice carried. "He's crazy. He killed the master." She was making the new story stronger. Caleb couldn't heal. He was crazy. The slaves, who were already scared of him, believed this story right away. It helped them understand the terrible things they had seen. The ghost Caleb, the quiet, strange man, had finally lost it. His magic turned to blood. This story kept them safe. It made sense of things that didn't make sense, and it gave their fear a single, real face that had mysteriously and conveniently disappeared. Within hours, people started looking for Caleb. Sheriff Brody came from Natchez with a pack of dogs and a dozen armed men. Their faces were serious. They were scared and mad. The story of a slave killing his master, especially in such a gruesome and ritualistic way, was a threat to the whole social order. It was a spark that needed to be put out right away. They rode to the red field, and even these tough guys were sickened by what they saw. Dr. Finch, who came with them, knelt by the body, his medical instincts completely overwhelmed. I don't get it," he said quietly, looking at the many small, precise cuts on the leg that was rotting. "This is a kind of scarification, or a horrible bloodletting. The sheer amount. How did he—" The hounds were taken to the edge of the swamp where Caleb had gone missing. They sniffed the muddy ground, whined, and walked in circles, not sure what to do. Caleb had walked into the river, and his mother's knowledge kept him safe again. He was aware that running water didn't have a smell, but he had also left a small gift for the person who lived in his hut. He had put a mixture of lye, pepper, and animal musk on the floor, which would make any tracking dog sneeze and get confused. The posse got mad because they couldn't find a trail. They jumped into the swamp and shot at shadows, their fear turning into anger. But the swamp kept its own safe. Caleb had left. Sheriff Brody started to question the slaves. He put the 47 witnesses in a line, with Finley standing next to him with a whip. "I want to know everything you saw," Brody said. "Every word." But the stories he got were a useless, jumbled mix of fear and superstition. "It was the ghost, Sheriff," one man stammered, his eyes wide. He sucked the life out. I saw it. He put his hands on the master, and the master just shrank." Another woman, crying, said she saw Caleb change. "He grew taller, Sheriff, and his eyes glowed red like fire. He drank the master's blood, which made him strong." Finley, who was now interested in Clara's story, tried to guide them. The sheriff could understand this. They were scared. It was a voodoo cure. The albino cut him trying to let the sickness out, and he cut too deep. He bled him like a stuck hog. A messed up, basic way to heal. It was still horrible, but it made sense. It gave him the chance to write a report. He couldn't write about vampires, he couldn't write about black magic. But he could write about a dangerous, mentally unstable fugitive who was practicing evil rituals and killing people. The official report, which was filed in the Adams County Courthouse, was a work of art in how it left out important details. It talked about Silas Croft's known sickness and how bad things were for him. It talked about how stupid it was for him to ask the albino slave Caleb, who was known to be a conjure man, for help. The report said that Caleb had killed his master by cutting him up in a frenzied, ritualistic way that caused a lot of blood loss and death. Caleb was given a warrant for his arrest. There was a $500 bounty on his head, dead or alive. The papers in Natchez and Vicksburg ran with the story, adding details to make it more interesting for their readers. They made Caleb out to be a savage white person, a voodoo addict, and a demon from the swamps who drank blood. The story was a warning to other planters. Keep your people in line, get rid of their primitive beliefs, and never, ever show weakness. The event's real, complicated horror, a desperate master begging for a cure and a brilliant, cold-blooded healer carrying out an execution, was hidden. The story was made simpler, turned into a weapon, and used to scare people into supporting the system that made Caleb in the first place. The act's real medical accuracy was lost and replaced by the more comfortable and racist story of savage superstition. The master of Cypress Bend Plantation did not live to see it. A month later, Silas Croft's brother came from Virginia. He saw the plantation as a burden, not a legacy. He saw the slaves, who were now angry, scared, and changed because of what had happened. He saw the red field that no one would plow because they thought it was cursed. He sold everything. Just like Clara had feared, the Natchez slave market, the forks of the road, and other places in the South sold slaves, including Clara and Marcus. A cotton speculator bought the land, but in 5 years he went bankrupt because of blight and a string of unexplained fires. The big house was empty, the white columns were turning yellow, and the windows were broken. People in the area stayed away from it. They said that on hot, humid nights you could see a pale white figure standing on the porch and looking out over the fields. The story of Caleb the Ghost grew and changed with each telling. He turned into a ghostly figure who haunted the banks of the Homachita River. People said he hunted cruel bosses, that he could drain a man dry without leaving a mark, and that his pale pink eyes could make you freeze. In death, he had become the very thing they had said he was in life, a monster from another world. People whispered the story for generations. It became a secret warning for slaves and later for sharecroppers. It was a story about how sick white men can be and how scary root work can be. But for the descendants of the 47 witnesses, the story meant something else. This wasn't a ghost story. It was a story about doing the right thing. The master's pure blood, which he used to justify his power, was the one thing that could kill him. This was the only time that the slave's secret, savage knowledge was better than the white man's science. The red field, which was never able to be farmed again, became a secret, holy place. People said that the red, iron-rich soil could heal, and sometimes local root workers would sneak onto the empty land to collect handfuls of it, thinking it had the power of Caleb, the power of a master's blood returned to the earth. The story turned into a complicated web of fear and strength, a reminder that the person who is most quiet, alone, and ignored could have the power to bring down an entire system, even if only for a short time. We are now going back to the cold light of history. For more than 100 years, the event at Cypress Bend was thought to be a folk tale, or a slave uprising. It was thought to be a strange, shocking, and ultimately superstitious event. The official record, Sheriff Brody's report, said that Caleb was a crazy killer. The slaves were scared and unreliable witnesses, and Silas Croft was a victim of his own desperation and a brutal act. This story was clear. It kept things the way they were. It strengthened the idea that enslaved people were primitive, emotional, and dangerous, and that only their masters could keep them in check. You didn't have to think too hard about this version of the story. It was a simple, brutal play about morals. But this version, like the white columns on Croft's house, was just a front that hid the rot inside. The truth was hidden in the very records that were supposed to keep the official lie safe. It wasn't in the sheriff's report or the sensational newspaper articles. It was in a different ledger that the public was never meant to see. It had the clinical, exact, and terrified notes of a scientist. A researcher from Tulane University bought a box of old medical books at an estate sale in Natchez in 1968. A small, leather-bound journal was hidden inside a thick book of Gray's Anatomy. It was Dr. Alistair Finch's personal ledger. He was the doctor who had treated Silas Croft and looked at his body. Finch couldn't say what he thought in public because of the prejudices of his time, but he wrote in his private journal with a chilling scientific clarity. He wrote, "I have looked at S. Croft's body," and the ink was neat and clear. The sheriff's report will talk about ritual and savagery. It is neither. The act, while grotesque, was one of unimaginable medical skill. The cuts on the leg are not random. They followed the exact paths of the subcutaneous vascular system. They are shallow, numerous, and designed to allow maximum blood flow from the capillaries, not a major artery. This was not a frenzied attack. It was a procedure. Dr. Finch's notes were a quiet bombshell, the first piece of evidence that went against the savage story. He was a white doctor, a man of his time, and he was admitting in secret that the ghost was a more sophisticated physician than he was. He was saying that this wasn't magic. It was a drug. Dr. Finch's journal went on, and his clinical detachment turned into a tone of awe and horror. The perpetrator, he wrote, must have had a deep, almost anatomical knowledge. But more, he must have understood Mr. Croft's specific, unique malady. Croft suffered from what I believe to be a hemophiliac condition, a failure of the blood to coagulate. I had warned him that any significant bloodletting would be fatal. The incisions themselves on a healthy man would have been superficial. On Croft, they were a death sentence. The healer must have known this. He must have recognized the symptoms, the bruising, the persistent bleeding, and used the master's own impure blood as the mechanism of death. Here, the truth was laid bare. Caleb had not just killed Croft. He had performed a lethal diagnostic execution. He had identified the hidden weakness, the very impurity that so terrified Croft, and he had turned it against him. The poultice of mud, the heated stones, the cupping, it was all a brilliantly staged ritual designed to accelerate a process that Caleb knew would be fatal. It was not a failed cure. It was a perfected one, a cure for the sickness of Silas Croft, which Caleb had identified as life itself. But there was one more document, discovered only in 2003, hidden in the wall of a collapsing sharecropper's cabin near the old plantation site. It was a single, folded page, brittle with age, containing a short, dictated letter. Clara's testimony, which she gave to her grandson just before she died in 1894, was very important. "My brother Marcus was beat for nothing," the testimony read. "The master was sick, his blood had gone bad. He was dead, but he wanted to take us all with him. The ghost, Caleb, was a quiet man. He knew the earth and the body. I went to him and asked him to save us. I didn't ask him to save the master. I asked him to save us. When the master begged him for a cure, Caleb told me what he would do. He said, "The master is obsessed with his blood. He believes it is pure. I will do as he asks. I will purify it. I will give it back to the earth that he stole." He knew what he was doing. He knew the master's blood wouldn't stop. It wasn't a conjure, it was a balance. He was balancing the scales. We all saw it. We all knew what it was. It wasn't a ghost. It was a man holding the master accountable to the very ground he stood on. The full story, assembled from these hidden fragments, is a narrative far more chilling than any ghost story. It is a tale of two healers. One, Dr. Finch, armed with the science of his day, mercury and laudanum, was powerless. The other, Caleb, armed with ancestral knowledge and cold observation, was anything but. Silas Croft, a man obsessed with the purity of his bloodline, was killed by the impurity in his own veins. He was not attacked. He wasn't killed as a sacrifice to a dark god. In a very real medical sense, his own body did him in. Caleb the ghost, the man who was at the bottom of the human ladder, was really a clinical patient and a brilliant killer. He didn't use magic to drain his master's blood. He simply opened the tap, knowing full well that the master's own body lacked the mechanism to close it. There were 47 people watching the ritual in the red field. It was a horrifying psychological play that made sure the story would be told and the legend would overshadow the clinical, precise, and completely human act of revenge. Caleb gave Croft exactly the cure he asked for, a final, complete, and fatal purification. What became of Caleb? He was never captured. The $500 bounty was never claimed. The swamp swallowed him. He stepped from the red field into the fog of the Homachito, and from there into history. He became, as he had always been, a ghost. He exists only in the terror he left behind, in the whispers of the slaves, and in the secret, terrified ledgers of the white men who tried to comprehend his act. He is a void, a question mark, a man who demonstrated a profound, lethal knowledge, and then vanished, leaving only a blood-soaked patch of earth and a legend that would outlive the plantation, the master, and the entire system of slavery itself. He is a testament to the fact that the deepest knowledge, and the most dangerous, is often held by those who have nothing left to lose. He used his intelligence as a weapon, and in one brilliant, terrible morning, he proved that the purest bloodline was no match for a single, focused mind armed with the secrets of the earth. The line between medicine and poison is, and always has been, one of dosage and intent. A man who had to become a monster of another system took down Silas Croft, a monster of one system. Caleb the ghost wasn't a ghost. He was a doctor. He was a man who, when he couldn't get any kind of conventional power, used his own intelligence as a weapon. He took apart the man who owned his body using what he knew about it. The blood on the field isn't the scariest thing about Cypress Bend. The mind put it there with cold, calculated accuracy. It is a story that reminds us that there were always hidden and silent variables in the brutal, dehumanizing math of slavery that could change the equation in the most terrifying and final ways. People say that the land at Cypress Bend is now a state-managed wildlife preserve. They also say that if you go to the area where the red field used to be, the soil still has a dark, coppery stain after 170 years, and the air still smells faintly of blood on hot, humid nights.